So it is with my great pleasure that I introduce and welcome Brian Glassman to today's Way Forward Leader Lunch Break presented by Cleveland Leadership Center. In many ways, Brian's the perfect person for today's conversation about redistricting. First, of course, are some impressive credentials: a BA from Connecticut College and a JD from the Boston University School of Law. He had been on full-time faculty for 27 years at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law, where, among other topics, he taught election law, apropos for today. He's organized a major conference on election integrity. He was co-presenter at 4 voting legislation litigation CLEs for the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association, helping his fellow lawyers navigate through all this. He has testified before the Ohio Redistricting Commission and is a member of the Fair Districts Mapping Competition Advisory Committee. Yes, that's a very short name for committee. As a part of that group last year, he helped select winning maps that proposed ways that Ohio voting districts could be redrawn. But like the gerrymandering that he studies, Brian's own journey has not always followed usual paths. Even before his early years of using law for social change at the Legal Aid Society, art has been his passion, in particular, glassblowing. He has studied at the Cleveland Institute of Art and the renowned Pilchuck Glass School in Washington State, which was founded by the esteemed glass artist Dale Chiavulli and other artists. His work has been shown nationally and also here at home, including at the Cleveland Museum of Art's May Show. So I mentioned this right side of his brain, not just because it complements his left brain legal thinking, but because it offered up a metaphor for today's session. Like the beautiful glass that Brian blows, democracy can be very fragile, a point that has been underscored recently. But glass is also very durable, as evidenced by centuries-old stained glass windows and other artwork that still glistens. Please join me in welcoming Professor Glassman to share with us how redistricting impacts our fragile yet durable democracy. Professor Glassman, take it away.
Thank you, Michael, for the very kind introduction. My thanks to the Cleveland Leadership Council for inviting me to present on this critically important topic at this critically important time. A welcome to Steve Steinglass, who's on the Zoom call today, friend and colleague and Dean Emeritus at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. He is the Ohio constitutional law expert, and we've had a number of discussions as this saga has unfolded. So I'm going to do a screen share, and please let me know if it's not sharing. Okay, Michael, can you see that? Okay, and no toolbar at the top, right? Okay. If only it was this simple. It's a beautiful chalk drawing from the Cleveland Museum of Art back in 2019, pre-pandemic. Yes, I did some work with Fair Districts. That's what my sign looked like in the upper left-hand corner at the start of this journey. That's what it looked like in the dead of winter. And as you see, a little bit worse for wear, but I just haven't brought myself to take it down. That's what it looked like as of a couple of days ago. So I wanted to share with you this roadmap for my presentation. And I wanted to cover some foundational principles essential to this presentation. First, the difference between election law and politics. My presentation is about election law, not politics. The former is the machinery by which we select our representatives. The latter is what happens when we turn that machinery on to identify winners and losers. It's also about how the winners wield the political power they've gained. The act of voting should be a nonpartisan, non-issue. The goal, to my mind, should be participation, and thus increasing access to the fullest possible extent without compromising security in our voting, and not to use parts of that machinery for partisan purposes. So let's disagree over who's the better candidate and who has better ideas, not over the way that we cast ballots. Wanted to cover some basics. First, reapportionment and redistricting. As you can see, reapportionment is this process that takes into account population shifts, both within states and nationally, for purposes of drawing voting districts. That's for state legislatures. It's also for the United States House of Representatives. There are winners and losers with each decennial census. As a result of this census, Texas and Florida picked up some seats in the United States House, and Ohio lost a seat. So its congressional delegation is now down to 15 members from 16 previously. And as you see, yes, this all happens thanks to the decennial census carried out by the US Census Bureau. Excuse me, and that was most recently in 2020. I want to briefly touch upon this cluster of cases from the early to mid 1960s from the United States Supreme Court. Over the course of these couple of years, the United States Supreme Court established the principle of one person, one vote, such that voting districts had to be and still have to be of equal population size. So that addressed one way in which the voting process was being manipulated for partisan purposes. What's gerrymandering? As you see here, it is a method of maximizing political advantage. The goal is to gain as many seats as possible in the legislature. It's accomplished by packing opponents' voters into as few voting districts as possible, and or by cracking them. That is to say, spreading them across as many voting districts as possible where their votes will be insufficient to elect the candidate of their choice. Some gerrymandering basics, three really important principles before I get to that. Bottom left of the screen is Elbridge Gerry, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and of course the salamander in the middle, and when you put the two together, you get gerrymandering. And this is a famous illustration of a famous gerrymander in Massachusetts in the early 1800s. But do keep these 3 points in mind as we proceed. First, who draws the voting maps? Second, what criteria are used in drawing those maps? And third, is there any judicial oversight of the results? And if so, is that from the state courts or the federal courts? So 55 years after Reynolds versus Sims, which I had shown you a moment ago, and 33 years after another US Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court affirmed that federal courts could decide partisan gerrymandering claims, the court says the exact opposite in 2019 in the case of Rucho versus Common Cause. As a result of which, partisan gerrymandering claims must be litigated in state courts under the state constitutions. When things are going well, in our representative democracy. Voters choose their leaders. But when gerrymandering is being employed, effectively leaders who have control over the map drawing process choose their voters. My view is that gerrymandering is corrosive to our representative democracy. I've already talked or mentioned briefly participation, which to my mind is the key to our robust representative democracy. If there is gerrymandering, elected officials don't have to work to get elected or to stay in office. Gerrymandering at present is being carried out in a highly polarized political environment. We hear more, both parties gerrymander. We hear more about Republican gerrymanders at this time because they have the power to do so. Why? Because that power resides with state legislatures, and Republicans control approximately 2/3 of all state legislatures. The other thing that is happening now that was not happening 200 years ago when that gerrymander of Massachusetts was drawn is that we have highly sophisticated computer software that allows for gerrymandering with what many have described as surgical precision. So that brings me to a quick bit of history. Beginning in 2010, a brilliantly conceived and executed strategy by Republicans to gain control of as many state legislatures as possible. Again, state legislatures write the rules for voting. And as you can see from this quotation from the New York Times, Republican strategists certainly appreciated that, focused on those legislative chambers where Democrats were holding a slim majority and sought to flip those. Republican strategists also understood that these state legislative races were relatively inexpensive. And thus it was money very well spent, and the results were dramatic. So let's take a quick look at what happened in Ohio. As you can see, upper left-hand corner in the Ohio House, Democrats had a 53-46 advantage in the 99-seat Ohio House in 2008. But in 2010, that flipped. And in both the House and the Senate, in subsequent years, the Republican Party protected and even grew its advantage in the two chambers. On the congressional side, even though Ohio votes at approximately a 54-46 ratio, Republican to Democratic, Republicans, as you see, have held 12 of the 16 congressional seats. That's obviously 75% in all 5 election cycles over the last 10 years. So, frustrated by this, voting rights groups got out the clipboards and used the ballot initiative process, which is available in Ohio, is not available in all states, to build anti-gerrymandering protections into the Ohio Constitution. This was going to be about process and product. So a more fair results in terms of Republican-Democratic balance, and in terms of the process, one that would be bipartisan and that would be more transparent. I'm talking about public hearings as well as the opportunity for Ohioans to participate in that process. So this is a quick overview of what happened. Let's start with the left-hand column. There was a ballot initiative in 2015. It became Ohio Constitution Article 11. Yes, there was, or there were proposed Republican maps. The lawsuit is called League of Women Voters versus Ohio Redistricting Commission, where voting rights groups challenge those proposed maps. And the first decision in the state legislative maps case was handed down on January 12th of this year. On the right side, congressional maps, a 2018 ballot initiative that became Ohio Constitution Article 19. Again, we're going to be talking about the proposed Republican map. Again, there was a lawsuit challenging that map, and the first decision on the congressional map was, as you see, 2 days later, January 14th. I want to highlight something on this screen, which is that the ballot initiatives passed by an overwhelming majority, indicating that voters of both parties were fed up with the system as it was, and understood that gerrymandering was bad no matter which party was doing it, and that over time both parties would have an opportunity. Ohioans voted for this. This was the Ohio Redistricting Commission. It is not a fully independent redistricting commission, but rather is comprised of elected officials, 7 members, 5 Republicans, and 2 Democrats. Over time, most of the votes from the Ohio Redistricting Commissions were along, strictly along partisan lines. So, with respect to that first ballot initiative, very important to keep in mind that Article 11 contains multiple references to partisan fairness and proportionality. The latter, of course, reflects that 54-46 ratio that I mentioned a couple of moments ago. There also are what are called mechanical construction requirements. These are important also. They cover things such as contiguity for voting districts, compactness for voting districts, and also that governmental units such as cities or townships not be split any more than absolutely necessary to achieve a constitutional map. Article 11 also gave the Supreme Court of Ohio what's called original and exclusive jurisdiction over all litigation arising under Article 11. Similar but not identical for the congressional map process. It became Article 19. No reference to proportionality, but multiple references again to partisan fairness. Also those mechanical construction requirements, which I described a moment ago, and also original and exclusive jurisdiction over all Article 19 litigation for the Ohio Supreme Court. Here is perhaps the first version of the state legislative maps proposed by the Republicans. Understand that both the General Assembly and at some stages in the process, and the Ohio Redistricting Commission, again comprised of elected officials, essentially did what we'd expect politicians to do. They acted to protect and enhance their political power, even if that meant not complying with the requirements of the 2 constitutional provisions, 11 and 19. So in that first case, that first decision again came out on January 12th. The Supreme Court invalidated the maps, the state legislative maps, because they failed to meet the partisan fairness and proportionality requirements. The court did indicate that proportionality should mean something like 54-46, reflecting how Ohioans vote on a statewide basis. So in the Ohio House, that would be something like a 53-46 split, Republican and Democratic seats, and 18 and then 15 in the Ohio Senate. The Ohio Supreme Court did retain jurisdiction in this case so that it could continue to review proposed maps that were submitted to see if they passed constitutional muster. If we have time, I will talk later about Chief Justice O'Connor's concurrence in that case. Here is the proposed congressional map that Republicans offered up. And here is what the Ohio Supreme Court did in its evaluation of that map. It invalidated it because, as you see here, the court concluded it excessively and unwarrantedly favored the Republican Party and disfavored the Democratic Party. The second bullet point goes back to the Ruccio case. I'm not going to take time right now to explain it. Maybe we'll have time during Q&A to do so. And the court also concluded that there were too many of those splits that I had described earlier. And for that reason, also, the Republican map did not pass constitutional muster. The court did not suggest that the congressional delegation from Ohio be split 54-46 at a 54-46 ratio, which would come out to 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And importantly, the court in this case did not retain jurisdiction for reasons which are difficult to understand, and that did have significant repercussions. So we jump ahead to May 25th, when the Ohio Supreme Court, having declared unconstitutional no fewer than 4 maps that were offered up, declared the proposed 5th state legislative map unconstitutional. Significantly, despite being urged to do so by advocates, the court did not hold the Ohio Redistricting Commission in contempt. Again, if we have time later, we can talk about that a little bit. It's very important to understand what the court's authority was and is, and what are the limits on that authority. As you see under Article 11, the Supreme Court cannot order the commission to implement a particular plan, cannot order the commission to draw a particular district. So the Supreme Court, through this series of cases, did what it had the authority to do, which was to declare these maps unconstitutional and send them back for redraw. And as you just saw, that happened 5 times with respect to the state legislative maps. In the meantime, to the surprise of many, Republican plaintiffs filed suit in a federal district court in Ohio, and that litigation did stick there, notwithstanding what I have already said about the Ruccio case from 2019. The federal court identified reasons why it was appropriate for this case to now be in federal court. Here is the first page of the court's order from April 20th. This was a 3-judge panel Two of the judges were appointed by then President Trump, and the third judge appointed by President Clinton. And the decision in this case was 2-1, perhaps in the way that you would expect that court to have split. And the court said, well, we're going to give Ohio a little more time to do this, but if they can't get it done by, I believe, May 28th, we're going to impose the third proposed legislative map so that Ohio can conduct its elections for state legislative offices. And that is, well, let's go to what happened. So first, we did have a primary on May 3rd. It was for statewide races and also for Ohio's congressional races, using that map that the Ohio Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional. What's next is more litigation. The litigation hasn't stopped. And voting rights advocates are now pressing for changes to the maps in time for the 2024 elections, but out of time for any possible changes to the 2022 elections. We're having another primary on August 2nd for those state legislative races. Again, using map 3, a map that the Ohio Supreme Court, interpreting the Ohio Constitution, has already declared unconstitutional. Another thing that's happening is that Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor is retiring. The composition of the 7-member Ohio Supreme Court is 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. Chief Justice O'Connor is a Republican, but she has sided with the Democrats in these cases. So these have been 4-3 decisions. With her retirement, there's going to be at least 1 change on the Ohio Supreme Court and possibly as many as 3. Question whether we have just gone through a constitutional crisis in Ohio, whether we successfully averted that crisis, or whether it has simply been delayed, excuse me. As you can see from this headline, the Ohio Redistricting Commission simply ignored the Supreme Court's order to produce map 6 by Monday, June 6th. Instead, resting on the assumption that the federal court's action in the case filed in federal court took care of things. So this is really significant. This is the General Assembly and the Ohio Redistricting Commission disregarding lawful orders of the Ohio Supreme Court, and that arguably has significant ramifications for these foundational principles: separation of powers, co-equal branches of government, as well as our system of checks and balances. Why does this matter? Well, going back to what Michael said in the introduction, because it turns out that our representative democracy really is a fragile thing. It requires protection, it requires support, and without that, it's at risk. And because individuals have the power to strengthen or weaken it, and because voting is not just a fundamental right, it is the fundamental right, since it protects all others. The Supreme Court of the United States, in passing, made this point over 130 years ago. And then in one of those 3 one-person, one-vote cases that I mentioned early on, Westbury versus Sanders, the court in that case explicitly said, I'll just let you read the quote, very eloquent. statement by Justice Black. So, what can Ohioans do to get involved if they seek voting districts that aren't gerrymandered? First, please vote. Yes, I know that Ohio voting districts are gerrymandered, but there are some competitive races. There are other races on that same ballot, and the worst thing you can do is throw up your hands in frustration and not participate. It is participation that will ultimately get us to a better result. You can advocate, speak with your elected representative, march or attend rallies, volunteer, and donate to organizations whose mission is the elimination of gerrymandering. Also, I don't think it would be a surprise if there was another initiative. It's already being talked about. So when that clipboard is handed to you, if you believe that gerrymandering is bad for our representative democracy, please sign it. And if there are enough signatures, that initiative will get on the ballot, and then you'll have a chance to vote for it. As I close, I wanted to offer just a couple of resources, which I selected carefully because they are, as you see, bipartisan or nonpartisan. These are good places for reliable information and to deepen your knowledge about this important subject. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Professor Glassman, for I will say, cramming years of controversy and rulings and issues into a relatively short period of time, and we appreciate that. You know, picking up with where you ended off, and we have had some questions come in, and please continue to chat with me directly or to the group if you have others. You know, speaking to what you talked about, reminding us to vote, and I appreciate that reminder because I think most people will miss the August primary, and in a state where voter turnout is already a challenge, that's going to be a shame. But really, can you talk more about the impact all this is going to have or has had on voter turnout? What's the incentive to vote when people see courts being ignored and things not changing? How can we have participatory democracy under these circumstances?
It's a great question. People have to find a way to get motivated. Again, as I said at the end of my presentation, not voting, even under the present circumstances, is really the worst thing one could do. Because, as I said, it's participation that's going to make a difference. As I said, I encourage everyone to get involved. When you get involved, you're going to meet people who are energized about this issue, and I think that you will find yourself getting energized by working with such people. So there are reasons to be discouraged, but this is not the time to throw up our hands and say, well, there's just nothing to be done. We have to believe that there is something to be done, and that our individual participation adds to that collective effort to get to a better place politically.
That's a good reminder that it's the sum of the whole, right? It's the sum of the parts. Mm-hmm. And we will share the resources that are in the end of the slide deck, and you can probably Google a million other voting rights organizations and advocacy organizations on your own where there could be involvement. You know, given what's been happening with the Ohio maps and really everywhere, you know, the party in power always controls the maps. And it looks like in the example you gave, it took a very little bit of money to flip those maps a while back. Relatively, $30 million, I think was the figure you had. Now, can you talk about the role of money in all this and what that's going to mean going forward in terms of what influences these elections and how the party not in power can ever hope to compete?
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, I want to just refine something you said. it took about $30 million to flip seats in state legislatures. And yes, generally state legislatures control the map drawing process, not all the time. I believe there are 8 states that have a truly independent redistricting commission. And in those cases, the map drawing authority has been withdrawn from partisan officials. And I'd argue the results are a lot better. So as for the money, that's a very large and separate topic. I wish it wasn't, I wish we weren't where we are in terms of how our campaigns are financed. But this is a time to donate because that matters in terms of getting the word out about the issues and about your right to vote, when to vote, how to vote, and so on.
You touched on the Supreme Court, and we had an interesting question come in about that. Given the fact that apparently our legislature doesn't have to listen to the Supreme Court, what impact will that have on really the future of the court in other areas and other things they rule on? Will there be an effect on the court's authority in other areas in trying to settle disputes at that level?
Is the question about the authority of the United States Supreme Court?
No, it was about the Ohio Supreme Court. Yeah, the Ohio Supreme Court, and how those, because the legislature didn't have to follow the Supreme Court's ruling in that, does that weaken the court, and what does that bode for other rulings that come before the court, the Ohio Supreme Court in the future?
Right, so this goes to the slides I showed about whether we had come through a constitutional crisis, and I think the answer is we're not sure yet. This is very troubling when a co-equal branch of government simply ignores lawful orders issued by, in this case, the Ohio Supreme Court. And it's hard to see things getting less partisan anytime soon. But this idea that the Ohio Supreme Court is the final word on interpretation of the Ohio Constitution is absolutely foundational. So very troubling that the Ohio legislature, that is to say the General Assembly and or the Ohio Redistricting Commission, believed that it had that it was within its rights to simply ignore the last order of the court, which was to draw another map.
I'm going to switch slightly because this is a question I had while other people were asking questions, formulating their questions. Since we are a leadership organization, I'm wondering if you could address the role of leadership in all this. What kinds of leaders does it take to affect real change in this arena? Have you seen any in the past, and what are the characteristics we need to get us somewhere else in the future?
Wow. Again, a great question. I think as leaders in the community, what these leaders do and demonstrate makes a tremendous difference. I would like to believe that I model for my students, and I think there may be something similar that happens at the citywide or regional level for leaders of organizations. So that means speaking up and speaking out about fairness in voting, and beyond that, it could be giving employees paid time off to go vote, since we don't have Sunday as our voting day, unlike other Western industrialized countries. So really modeling behavior, and I can't say this too forcefully. This really isn't about politics. This is about our electoral process and participation. As I tell my students, I don't care how you vote, I care that you vote. And so perhaps that can be a message also that community leaders can offer their staffs and the communities they serve.
we may need a Cleveland Leadership Center program on voting. This is a magic wine question. You mentioned ballot issues might be a way to address all this. How would you design a ballot issue that would address and fix as many of the problems as possible?
Well, again, the most immediate problem is going back to that early slide, who gets to draw the maps? The Redistricting Commission that was offered up to the voters, as I said, not a truly independent Redistricting Commission. I believe it was the result of a political compromise. It was what voting rights groups could get. I think they understood that it was not the ideal solution. But looking at some very recent news stories, I think even they were surprised at the degree of partisanship that occurred. Again, virtually every vote was along partisan lines, and things were built in to the constitutional amendments that some thought would encourage bipartisanship, and it just didn't work that way. So I think first and foremost, a truly independent redistricting commission made up of non-politicians. Another option would be a single demographer who would draw the maps, but giving control to elected officials who are hardwired to protect and enhance their political power. We have now seen, at least in Ohio, it just does not work.
And we have time for one last question that just came in, and it's a little technical, but I think it's important, is why the Ohio Supreme Court didn't find the Ohio Redistricting Commission in contempt. Since there were no repercussions, how could you expect anything to have been changed given that?
So this is a really important question. Many voting rights advocates wanted the commission to be held in contempt. I'm just going to share with you a couple of things that we all know did happen, and then my observations. My observation is that Chief Justice O'Connor in particular was very concerned about this constitutional crisis, and the Supreme Court holding members of the legislative and executive branches in civil contempt was not going to ease that constitutional crisis. Beyond that, there was, to my view, extraordinary pressure placed on Chief Justice O'Connor. I don't know that she yielded to that pressure, but it was there. It included talk of impeaching her. And there was also a bill that was introduced that would have charged the Ohio Supreme Court the $20 or $25 billion for the cost of running that second primary. The court may simply have concluded that civil contempt was not going to produce the required result, which was would have been a bipartisan approved map. And the court left it for another time. The court could still pursue civil contempt against the commission, but there's nothing occurring on that front at this time.
Well, thank you, Professor Glassman. Please join me in giving him a round of applause or a thumbs up. We really appreciate you taking a complicated and important topic and breaking it down for us and encouraging us all to get involved in the electoral process, however that may be, voting, advocating, or anything else to help ensure a representative democracy.